We are going to be in Luke chapter 14 this morning. Oh, hold on. I'm doing wrong. I'm getting ahead of myself. Not Luke 14. 1 Corinthians. What am I doing? I got it mixed up. At the last minute, I decided to change it up a little bit. I had this message prepared originally for the sermon time. But 1 Corinthians chapter number 1. I apologize for that. We're going to be all over the place in this message this morning. In Luke 14, we're going to look at a parable, Lord willing, during the preaching time. And I was going back and forth on what to do, because today is Independence Day, you know. And that doesn't mean I have to acknowledge that necessarily, you know. What I'm saying is the Lord is not constrained to our holidays, okay? He's not. Just because a holiday is coming up, you know, a federal holiday that the government says is a holiday, doesn't mean that the Lord cares. You know, so if He lays something else on my heart on Independence Day, I'm going to preach what He tells me to do, not just because it's Independence Day.
Amen. All
right? Now, I did wear a red tie with some blue on it, with a white shirt, because it's Independence Day. I'm celebrating it a little bit. But the title of the message is Independence. All right? Independence. And this idea of independence. That's a very interesting word. There's a lot of meaning to the word independence. Now, today is Independence Day, and when we think about Independence Day, what are we celebrating as far as the United States is concerned? As far as the United States is concerned, there were a group of 13 colonies that were on the East Coast. If I remember, let me see if I can remember them. Maine was not one of them. Maine wasn't a colony yet. It was part of the Massachusetts colony. Massachusetts used to be a lot bigger. But anyways, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, I think was a colony at that time, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Delaware, Rhode Island, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and I know I missed one. I missed one somewhere in there. I can name 12 of them. There we go. There's 12 of them. But I know I missed one in there, and I can't remember which one it is. Maryland. Got it. All right. Maryland was a Catholic colony. If you want to understand why there were 13 different colonies, there were 13 different beliefs, basically. Well, not exactly like that, but Maryland was founded to be a haven for Catholics who were fleeing persecution from different areas of the world, and they wanted to govern themselves. New York was actually a colony by the Dutch. It was called New Amsterdam at first. England bought it from them and named it New York. There is a York, England. That's why there's a New York. That's why there's a New Hampshire, because there's a Hampshire, England. And so, you know, you get what I'm saying. Virginia, if I remember correctly, was also founded as a Catholic colony as well. I believe the name comes from the Virgin Mary. And then if I remember correctly, I'm fuzzy on Virginia. But I think Carolina was named after some queen. And then Georgia was actually started as a penal colony. And what that means is if you got in trouble in England, they sent you there because you were basically not a violent criminal. You were someone who owed a debt that you couldn't pay back. And they had this thing called debtor's prison back then. And so to empty their jails, they sent their vagabonds and bad guys to Georgia. So Georgia has that as their background. Australia was founded in the same way, just so you understand. A whole continent was founded by that. But anyway, Rhode Island was a Baptist colony, and it became a colony because Roger Williams got kicked out of Massachusetts for being a Baptist. Massachusetts was a Congregationalist colony, is what they called it. And they were Puritans, basically. They wanted to try to purify the Catholic Church from within. They knew a lot of things of the Church of England were corrupt, and so they wanted to purify. That's just history in a nutshell. That's where the 13 colonies were coming from. You understand? They were Pennsylvania was started by Quakers. That's why we call it Quaker State. William Penn was a Quaker. I learned this one time. America drilled for oil the first time, I always thought Texas, of course. You know, Houston Oilers, come on. But no, the first time America drilled for oil was in Pennsylvania. That's why we have Pennzoil and Quaker State. I didn't know that. That's pretty interesting to me. Anyway, all those little tidbits, those 13 colonies felt like the King of England was oppressing them. They felt like he was taxing them without representation. They had a thing called the Houses of Parliament over there, and we weren't being represented. They would pass laws governing us, but we had no representation. We had no Congress people, we had no senators, we had nobody like that to voice our concerns. Basically, we had a governing body over in England who would pass really stringent and rigid, strict was the word I was looking for, awful laws on their colonies, yet the colonies had no voice. They couldn't say anything. Well, that was making people a little bit mad, as you can imagine. The government of England was governed by the Church of England, the Catholics. That was basically a Catholic organization. And the church would do this. They would tax you to pay for their ministers. They would do things like that. How would you like that? How would you like it if your government taxed you to pay for Catholic ministers? They did that. Well, it was angering a lot of people. And that's actually where the idea of taxation without representation came from. It was actually a religious thing. A lot of the Protestants weren't happy about that stuff. I've read accounts where people had their houses taken from them, they had their livestock taken from them, all because they wouldn't pay taxes to England without being represented. People started getting mad enough to fight a war. You have to be pretty mad to actually take up arms against your ruling government. And we're talking about people who were in their Bibles, and they knew what the Bible said about honoring the king. They knew what Jesus had said about honoring their government. They knew those things. And they were willing. They felt like the Lord was with them. They felt like the Lord didn't want them living under a tyrant. And so that was the idea. That's where Independence Day comes from. These weren't perfect people, but they basically wanted to be independent of the King of England. Not because he's a king. You do realize, get this, we've got this bad taste in our mouth about kings. After that, France had a revolution. They overthrew their king. I think it was King Louis the 14th or something like that. The king in England now has very little power, mainly because of what the Americas did. And you know, we have this democracy's wonderful and all this stuff. Democracies are only wonderful if the people are wonderful. Democracies can be absolutely terrible, because democracy means the opinion of the people. Well, if the people are wicked, then the democracy will be wicked. You do understand, the government, it's not just bad because it has a king. The king can be good. If the king is good, then the kingdom is good. Read about David. King David, right? Now, that's an excellent example. Did you hear anyone crying out for revolution under his rule? Some of them did. Under Absalom, he put it down, and he had a good reign, right? Then you have Solomon come along, and he becomes kind of a tyrant. And you see the people call him, we want a different king. You see what I'm saying? You can see this play out through human history over and over and over again. One day, get this, the perfect government is coming under a king. And his name is Jesus. And the Bible says he will rule and reign on this earth. And it will be perfect. We don't have a perfect government right now. Not at all. Lots of flaws. Tons of flaws. It's had flaws from the beginning. You can see flaws from the beginning. But I think we probably have the best human government possibly ever. I don't know, King David would be right there. Certain kings that ruled were really good kings throughout time. So that's hard to say. I do believe America has done more worldwide than probably any nation that's ever existed, as far as giving food assistance, trying to help people, sending missionaries to try and start churches. I think America's probably done more. So all that being said, that's what Independence Day is about. It's about celebrating America's independence from a tyrant. That's what it's about. It's about independence from tyranny. Now, all that is just background. I want to say this, number one this morning, I like being an independent church, independent Baptist. I like being independent. Here's why. I want to explain why. Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter number 1. And verse number 1 says, Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother, verse number 2, unto the church of God which is at Corinth. You catch that? The church of God which is at Corinth. That's an independent church. They are not dependent upon Jerusalem, the church at Jerusalem. They are not dependent on the churches of Galatia. They are not dependent upon the church at Rome. They are not dependent upon the church at Thessalonica. Turn in your Bibles a little bit. Over to, let's see. Yeah, the next book, not 2 Corinthians, but Galatians. The next book with a different name. Galatians, chapter number 1, verse number 2. And all the brethren which are with me unto the churches, plural, of Galatia. You realize what he's saying there? These are independent churches. Galatia was an area, it'd be like me writing a letter to the churches of McCurtain County. There's a lot of churches, right? Or the churches of Oklahoma. So it's an area when you say Galatia. And so it's not a town. Corinth was a town. It was a city. Galatia is an area with a bunch of towns in it. So it has a bunch of churches in it. You understand? When you say local church, you're talking about a location. You know, not that the church is a place or a building. It's where that body of believers from that area meet. See what I'm saying? They have a local church. They are local to one another. I'm not meeting with a church in Oklahoma City this morning. You know why I'm not? Because it's not local. Now, if I could be there in 2 minutes, that would become local. Used to, think about this, in our area we've got the community of Golden, Broken Bow, Idabel. What is your community considered right there in Texas? What is it? Albion community. All these, Garvin, we're in Garvin right now. We are just right outside Idabel, believe it or not. We're right outside the city limits. So we've got Idabel, we've got all these communities. You know, if you were in a horse and buggy, or if you were riding a horse, how quickly can you get somewhere? Let's say maybe you don't have those modes of transportation and you have to walk. Let's say you're going to walk. How far do you want to walk to church? Do you want to walk 20 miles? Or would you rather walk, say, maybe a couple of miles? 2 or 3. Now, I know, I understand, but you're still thinking about today's world. In that day, people were used to walking. I have heard of people today, in our day and age, walking 8 miles in blinding snow to get to church in Alaska. We've got, I've heard missionaries in Alaska reporting, they're on the fringes. I'm telling you, if you really want to go to church, okay, so what I'm saying is, that's local. And back before transportation was so easy, now, I drive, yesterday I drove all over the county, like 2 or 3 times. It's easy. I have transportation. It does it, right? So I can, my local is kind of expanded a little bit with transportation. Really stop and think about what all has happened just with the invention of the car. It has changed everything. The 6,000 years before that, traveling was different. It was just different. I'll be reading the history of the Civil War or something. Yes, and these troops marched for 30 miles that day, and it was major. And I'm like, I can do 30 miles in 30 minutes. We don't think like people thought like back then. You understand what I'm saying? So 2,000 years ago, when Paul is writing these letters, he's writing to local churches. These would be churches that are independent of one another. They aren't depending on one another. You understand? They are independent. They are their own church. They are their own local New Testament church. When Paul would go town to town, he would start a local New Testament church. He would first go into the synagogue and preach to the Jews and say, hey, your Messiah came. You better receive him. Some people would, some people wouldn't. But he would start a church. And then they would start having church. A lot of times they'd have church in their house. The church is not the building. It is the body of people. Philemon, the book of Philemon, is written to a guy who, it's probably the church at Colossae, but that church was meeting in his home. Okay? And so they had that sort of thing. Listen, and in that day, you got persecuted for being a Christian. You could possibly be killed. Today, we could be a Christian out in the open. It's wonderful. Do you know those people would have given anything to experience what we're experiencing today? They would have loved this. You mean you can have a church building? And have a place where we meet publicly? We put out a sign and tell people we meet there? That's how they would respond. If you could build a time machine and go back and talk to these early Christians, that's how they would respond. You're kidding. You can do that. That's amazing. You have freedom to be independent. These were independent churches. I got to tell you, corruption is flooding churches. And in my opinion, it's starting from the top down. I mean, I could be wrong, but it's all over the place. But corruption of doctrines, corruption of Bible teaching, corruption of it's in supposedly Christian colleges. Harvard is one of the most liberal colleges on the face of the planet, right? It started off as a Christian college. John Harvard was a Christian in the early colonies. And he said the reason he was starting his college was to help people further their faith in the Bible. Yale was started the same way. Princeton was started the same way. You cannot say that today. The corruption has been pretty absolute. And those are just some examples. Baylor. What do you think of when you think of Baylor University today? Isn't Baylor in Dallas? What do you think of when you think of Baylor? Do you think of, that's a Christian bastion? That's a Christian stronghold? I don't think that. When I think of Baylor, I think, well, they've put a lot into their athletics. They've got a good football team. That's about it. You're going to get a very secular education at Baylor. Baylor was a Southern Baptist university. Lester Roloff went to Baylor University. Lester Roloff was a really big-time preacher in the early 1900s. He actually got thrown in jail for his stands. He was trying to help people get off of alcoholism and drug addiction. And the government said, you can't be that strict on him. And he said, well, then just go ahead and throw me in jail then. And they did, and he didn't back down. I believe the governor of Texas had pardoned him and said, no, we're not throwing that man in jail for that. That's ridiculous. At least somebody had some common sense back then. But I'm telling you, the corruption started a long time ago. And it's just getting worse and worse. And these colleges, these Bible colleges, I'm not against all Bible colleges. I think they're great things. They can be good things. But corruption is corrupting preachers. And preachers are going out and having corrupt doctrines. And, here's the thing. I like being an independent church. I like being independent because I can be careful about what influences I allow in my doors. What influences I allow in our church. What influences I allow on me. I like being independent because we're independent. We're not dependent on other churches. That's how it was from the beginning, believe it or not. That's how it was from the beginning. They were independent, local New Testament churches. I like being an independent, local New Testament church. I think it's more biblical. I think it's a wonderful thing. I'm not against fellowshipping with other churches. I think they need to be of like faith and doctrine. I think you need to look at that stuff. But I like fellowship. I'm not against fellowship. Not at all. But I like being an independent Baptist church. Number two, I like being an independent family or individual, you might say. I like having my independence. I like having freedom. I like not living in a communistic society. I like not having too much government overreach. I like if I feel like buying some fireworks and shooting them off, I can do that. I like if I choose not to do that. I can choose not to do that. I like if I want a snow cone, I can buy a snow cone. I bought a snow cone yesterday. Strawberry with cream on it. It was good. I like being able to do things like that. I like having independence. I like being able to spend my money where I want to spend my money. Or choose not to spend my money. I like having those freedoms. Listen, that may sound like, well, duh. Not everyone has that. In fact, the majority of the world does not have that. They don't have that. They simply do not. They are told what kind of car they will buy. They are told when they will buy it. They are told where they can go and when. They are told how they will stand and how they will speak and how they will do this and how they... There are totalitarian governments. That word totalitarian means it is total. They have total control. There are totalitarian governments everywhere. And history is filled with them. History is filled with them. It's not a new thing. And I believe it's slowly creeping into the United States. I really do. I see it. It's not 100% there yet, but it's going. It's going. You say, what's doing it? Taking away people's independence. You start taking them. You start stripping them of their rights. You start. Okay, this is why I think people ought to have the right to bear arms. See, that was the Second Amendment. You know why those guys put that in there? Because they had just fought a war with their government. It wasn't put in there so they could hunt deer. It was put in there because they had just shot redcoats. And they saw what government overreach can do. They saw the tyranny of it, and they felt like a person, an individual, ought to have the right to defend themselves. They did not feel like that person ought to have the right to commit murder or anything like that. No, there's laws against that. But they felt like that person ought to have the right. If you can't defend yourself, then you cannot defend your rights. They knew that. And they knew that if you can't defend your rights, then the government will take them from you. They will. Give them a little time. It'll go. People are becoming more and more dependent on the government. Very scary to me. Very scary, because you're losing your independence. It's a very sad thing. It's scary to me. I believe it's enslavement. Slowly. Here's another reason that makes me very paranoid. Because the Bible talks about this guy called the Antichrist. And one day when he comes on the scene, it will be totalitarian. He will totally take over everything. And I believe we're getting the stage set for it. I really do. I can see the seeds being planted. I can see the beginnings of it. I like being independent. I like being an independent individual. I like that my family has some independence. I like that we have freedom. I like independence. That's the second thing that I'm pointing out this morning. The third thing I want to point out with you is, with all of that in mind, I want you to remember something. You're not 100% independent. You are dependent. The key thing is learning where to draw the lines. Let me point this out. Try not eating anything for a month. You will find that you are very dependent upon food. Try not drinking any water. You will find your body is very dependent upon water. Try going without any sleep. You will find your body is very dependent upon rest. We are dependent upon some things, and the number one thing I want to remind you, that even an independent church is dependent upon, that even an independent individual or family is dependent upon, is Jesus Christ. We have absolute dependence upon Him. Without Him, we're not actually a church. It's His church. Remember, that's what He said. I will build my church, is what He said. You understand? It's His church. So we are completely dependent upon Christ. Turn over to John chapter 10. Look there with me, if you will. This message was kind of ruminating in my mind when we were studying this parable. John chapter 10, verse number 9. Jesus said, I am the door. It's a funny statement. He's not saying he's a literal door. Okay. But he's saying, if I were to tell Jonica, go to the fellowship hall. You are in timeout. If I were to tell her to go to the fellowship hall, hey, Johnny, would you mind going to the fellowship hall and grabbing me a bottle of water or, whatever? How would you get there? You would go through the door, wouldn't you? But you wouldn't go through the wall. Well, obviously not, right? It's common sense. You go through the door because that's the way. That's the way you go in the fellowship hall. Jesus is the door into heaven. He said, I am the door. Well, how do you go to heaven? You go the way. You go the way. You take the correct way. You go through the door. I am the door, he says. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. He'll have freedom. He'll have some independence when he realizes his dependence upon Christ. See, this is the thing that people have got to get their minds wrapped around. We were created to serve. We were created to serve. It's not based on our service. It's not based on how well we serve or anything like that. But we were created to serve. Adam and Eve, get this, worked the garden when they were created. But when they decided they wanted a different Lord, when they decided they wanted to be lords of their own lives, remember what the temptation was? Satan told Eve, ye shall be as gods. You'll get to take his place in your life. Remember that? Well, they realized, whoa, that was a bad trade. Because they actually got Satan as a Lord after that. And it wasn't a good trade. And Jesus is freely offering people to come back through the door. To get right with him. To be born again. To receive him. Jesus said, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved. If you go through Jesus, you'll be saved. Understand? We are dependent upon Jesus. Look at verse number 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. What are sheep without a shepherd? Lost, yeah. Pretty helpless. I can think of a lot of words, and they're not very complimentary. Pathetic, useless, defenseless, scared. Boy, we need the shepherd, don't we? We're very dependent on the shepherd, right? Get this. This is amazing. We are even dependent on Jesus to be the sheep. We need him to be the perfect sheep. We are such useless sheep. We need Jesus to be the perfect sheep. He is the Lamb who's been slain before the foundation of the world. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. We need him to do that. We're dependent upon Jesus giving his life for us. That's amazing. We are dependent upon Jesus. Look at John 14:6. I mentioned that that's the way to the fellowship hall. Jesus is the way to heaven. John 14:6. Jesus says unto him, I am the way. He's basically saying, I'm the way to God. I'm the way to heaven. It says, Jesus said unto him, I am the truth. Listen, if you don't want to believe a lie, then you're dependent upon Jesus. You need Jesus. I am the truth. I am the life. Boy, if you want eternal life, then you're dependent upon Jesus. Because he's the life. If you want to have life and have it more abundantly, he says, then you're going to need Jesus. You're dependent upon it. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. You want to meet the Father? You got to go through Jesus. It's dependent upon Jesus. Chapter 15, verse 5. Look at this. This is a verse about our dependence upon Christ. John 15:5. Jesus said, I am the vine, ye, saved people, that's people who know Christ, are the branches. Have you ever cut a branch off of a vine? Or off of a tree? Is the branch anything then? It's just dead, isn't it? It's not going to grow, is it? It's just going to sit there and rot. It's just going to... You know how dependent that branch is on the vine? You know how dependent that branch is on the tree? It's the key, isn't it? Jesus is the key. We are so dependent on Him. We need to recognize that. I love my independence. I really do. I love being independent. But I've got to recognize my dependence upon Christ. And I've got to keep that at the forefront. That's the key to me being independent. That's the key to me having some freedom, is Christ. That's the wonderful thing about Christ as our master. We think any master is going to be a cruel tyrant. No. Christ is a wonderful master. He's very good to us. He will treat us right. He's a good boss. It's okay to have a boss. I just like him to be a good one. I've had some bad bosses. I don't like bad bosses. I like having good bosses. John 8:36. Look at this one. One more we're going to look at. John 8. I'll tell you what, look at verse number 32 first. And ye shall know the truth. Remember, Jesus said, I am the truth. And the truth shall make you free. You want to be free? Then you're dependent upon Christ. We'll need the truth. If that's not clear enough for you, look at verse 36. If the Son, and that's capitalized, that's Jesus, therefore shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed. I tell you what, I like independence. But I'm only as independent as I recognize my dependence upon Christ. I'm telling you, I'm convinced of this. I'm so convinced of this. If you aren't depending upon Christ, if you're not walking with the Lord, then you are a slave. You are a slave to sin. You're a slave to your flesh. Lost people who do not receive Christ are a slave of the devil. Jesus looked at the Pharisees who weren't saved. They were religious, but they were not saved. They did not have a relationship with Christ. He said to those Pharisees, you're of your father, the devil. In other words, you're of your master, the devil. I'm convinced of this. If you really want to have freedom, and it starts with spiritual freedom, and then it can start to become intellectual freedom. It grows from being spiritual freedom. And He can start freeing up your mind from the sin that has corrupted it. He can start freeing up your body. He can start helping you to have victory over your flesh. But it starts with that spiritual freedom, you receiving Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. I'm telling you, if the Son therefore shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed. I believe the Lord's done a wonderful work in my life since I received Him in my life. I believe He's given me a lot of freedom. I believe He's freed me up of a lot of things. I believe one day it's going to be total freedom when I get my new body. And I got guaranteed that new body when I got saved. I'm telling you, the Son is making us free. And we shall be free indeed. Do you know Jesus Christ this morning? I love being independent. Love it. It's one of my favorite words. But I'm only independent if I recognize my dependence upon Christ. If I recognize my dependence upon Christ. George Washington said, he's basically in a nutshell, he said, if America ever turns their back on God, then they will fall. What a prophecy. He said, we're independent. We sure are. But it's based on our dependence upon Christ. That's pretty interesting, his thoughts there. Yeah, I love my independence. Are you dependent upon Christ this morning? Do you recognize that? Do you know it? One more. I'm going to read one more verse to you. You don't have to turn there. Colossians 1:17. I thought of this after I made my notes. One more. Listen to this verse from Colossians 1:17. And Jesus is before all things, and by him all things consist. You want to know how much you depend upon Christ? It says everything consists. Did you know Jesus is holding this whole thing together? The elements. You know how it says in 2 Peter chapter 3 that the elements will melt with fervent heat? Do you know all that has to happen there is Jesus just has to take his hand away from it and let it melt. You want to know why everything's going, why this world, scientists are baffled at how wonderful our world works together. Because we don't find this anywhere else. We don't find this on any other planets. We don't find the wonderful oxygen and the elements being in perfect order. We don't find that. You know who's doing that? According to the Bible, Jesus is holding all of that together. You want to know how dependent you are on Jesus? You're dependent on him for everything. He created everything. He created the materials that built the room you're sitting in. He created the technology. He creates the food. He's created. We are totally dependent upon Christ. I hope you'll recognize that this morning. I'm going to ask you to take a second, bow your head, talk to the Lord this morning. Recognize your dependence upon him. Your total dependence upon him this morning.